What if you could remember more than your own eyes in a mirror? A young lady without speaking, a memory-resistant mirror. In a fear-dominated household, who really has the power? Could years of misery be transformed into something much more dreadful by a single silent presence? When the reflection starts to observe you back, what happens? The Avery estate stood like a monument to dust and quiet in the oppressive heat of a Georgian summer in 1856. A renowned Mexican-American war veteran, Colonel Elias Avery governed his territories and household with the same icy he once enforced discipline on battalions. However, this is not the colonel's story. It is the property of the lady he married and the person who observed her from the periphery of life. In Charleston society, where women were taught to wear lace and to ignore their doubts at a young age, Clarissa Avery had grown up. Being old enough to recall faces long since buried, she brought a heritage mirror framed in black walnut and a dowry rich with coins to the Avery plantation. In her personal space, the mirror hung as a somber reminder of her isolation. It wasn't conceit that brought her to it every night, but she also needed to see herself unaltered and whole in a world that rarely represented who she really was. Clarissa woke up sweating on the first night of the incident. In her dream, she saw rows of shattered black teeth arranged in a circle. When she lit her oil lamp and walked across the room, she noticed a strange symbol, a jagged curve with a single vertical line, etched faintly onto the lower left corner of the mirror. The previous evening, there had been no scratches. She touched the surface with her finger. The glass was smooth and chilly. She remained silent, but the returning symbols. A fresh one every morning, always modest and tiny. Some were geometric anomalies, while others looked like old letters. The housekeepers denied being aware. She was dismissed by the colonel. His words were, "It's an old mirror," Clarissa said. "Glass remembers odd things." And she paused. Under a loose floorboard, she started a private journal, identifying the dates and using a charcoal nub to draw each symbol. Amara, a 15-year-old house slave who was born silent and had eyes that showed neither submission nor revolt, but only unrelenting observation. Every morning she swept the room, her footsteps silent, her presence almost ethereal. Clarissa didn't hear her sigh, murmur, or even heavy breathing. However, a new symbol would emerge every morning after Amara had arrived and left. Clarissa's nerves were frayed by the 10th night. She slept with the oil lamp burning, concealed the key under her pillow, and locked the bedroom door from the inside. Nevertheless, a spiral inside a triangle, the 11th symbol, appears. She started dreaming again, this time of a woman with hands stained with something darker than mud, crying by a river. Clarissa reached out in her dream, but like vapor, a hand moved through the person. Soft, continuous scratching that came from inside the mirror began on the 12th night. She was afraid to handle it. She placed a white linen sheet over the glass the next morning. The lines of a new symbol are pressed through the fabric, 2 dots over a horizontal bar, like eyes above a mouth that is sealed shut. However, linen is thin by candlelight, just like lace. She started writing cryptic, hint-laced letters to her sister in Savannah. She wrote that there is a presence in the room that is not a part of the living. However, the letters never made it out. Without a comment, the colonel returned them after intercepting them and silently reading them. That evening, she discovered a 13th sign engraved on the wooden frame of her vanity rather than the mirror. Amara continued to come and go, always at the same hour, always with the same serene efficiency, while a little crescent twisted inward as though reflecting upon itself. She did some dusting. She swept. She never touched the mirror's glass, only the frame. Her stillness started to sound more like intention than absence. Clarissa observed her, out of the corner of her eye, hoping to catch her in the act, but Amara's hands moved, not a finger out of place, but solely with the implements of work. Clarissa tried to confront her on the morning of the 20th. She stood between the mirror and Amara, making wild gestures at the newest symbol and then the girl's hands. After meeting and holding her gaze, Amara turned slowly and silently walked out of the room. Long after midnight that night, Clarissa waited by the mirror. The wind howled, the oil in her lamp flickered low, and the house slept. Her image faltered. For a brief moment, another face emerged behind her shoulder. Not Amara's, older, mouth sewed shut, eyes closed, then nothing. With the morning came the 21st symbol. Secrets only spread as far as the eyes of those who dared to see them, and the Avery plantation had long been a world of walls and whispers. As if she were a shadow sewn to the borders of light, Amara walked across this universe. Despite her quiet, she knew more than anyone could have ever imagined. She was aware of which doors concealed the silent horrors of the Avery family, which rooms housed sadness, and which dwellings had fear. She had never owned words, but she was always observing, listening, and remembering. Friends. Her silence served as a cloak and a shield, enabling her to move covertly and be a presence that no one feared or questioned. So she watched. She observed that the colonel's hand rested on the housewomen's backs for a longer period of time than was appropriate. Like mercury running over metal, his rage flared and cooled. How the weight of his wife's uneasiness caused her eyes to hollow out. She kept track of every gesture, sigh, and rebuke that was muttered in her head, and later in the little journal she concealed under her cabin's loose floorboards. Amara's mom had passed away during gave birth to her, a victim of the same hands that now held strict power over the plantation. That information had become a stone in her chest. She wore it with the calm forbearance of one who understood that time was both an ally and an enemy. The notebook served as her confession, her testament, and her roadmap. She sketched the symbols she observed in her dreams in it. Before quiet seized her, she recalled signs from stories her mother had said. Symbols that stand for disobedience, caution, and protection. In order to make sure they would endure long after her body might be gone, she meticulously tracked them down. The colonel's wife's mirror was transformed from glass into something greater in this way. It turned into a conduit. Amara started to notice that the markings of her ancestors' knowledge, the symbols of her ancestry, and her nightly sketching on scraps of paper seemed to awaken something in the mirror. Clarissa would awaken to a fresh etching every morning, one that was invariably delicate, accurate, and untraceable by human hands. The mirror responded, not just reflected. Throughout it all, the plantation slept. The house servants moved with the strict obedience required of them, while the other slaves dared not loiter close to the master's residence. Amara was the only one who hovered between compliance and observation, her thoughts constantly alert and her hands occupied with cleaning. On certain evenings, she would spend hours sitting in the corner of the empty room, listening to the wind rustle the shutters, listening for the smallest sign of danger or revelation, mentally sketching the shapes that could one day come in handy. Amara stayed later than normal one night after the 12th symbol showed up on the mirror. She didn't move, she didn't take heavy breaths, and she didn't let her shadow extend past the room's corner. The light source flickered. The candle broke, but she stayed. For the first time, she sensed a draw from the mirror itself, as though the glass recalled her mother, her ancestry, and her suffering, and she recognized something horrifying in that pull. The mirror was more than just an observer. It was paying attention. The days that followed were tense. Clarissa became more and more agitated, talking only to herself and walking around the house as if invisible eyes were praying for her. She started making notes for herself, quickly scrolling through doodles, questions without answers, and reminders of the symbols. Her correspondence with Savannah increased. More frantic, her words more disjointed. She spoke of a silent observer, something that moved silently behind her, and a presence in the room. However, she was unaware of its origin, and the terror that seized her prevented her from noticing Amara's silent touch. Amara, on the other hand, started making her own marks in the space. Subtle scratches along the wooden frame, shapes that only she could decipher, symbols that held the weight of warning and prophecy, not on the paper, not on the mirror. Every mark was a physical manifestation of her presence, a whisper. No one else could understand the jargon she was using. Comprehend, but the mirror still responded. By the 25th night, the etchings had grown in number, creating a language of lines, curves, and spirals that appeared to be alive beneath the surface. On the 27th night, Clarissa made an effort to speak with Amara face to face. She pointed to the mirror, to the unfathomable marks, to the shuddering terror in her own image. Amara looked directly into her eyes, mute, unyielding, and unwavering. Her eyes were devoid of shame, begging, or apology, only acknowledgement, a knowing of wrongs committed, anguish suffered, and power hidden from view. Clarissa instantly flinched as she realized the weight of that silent, motionless presence. However, she was unable to identify the fear that overcame her. Ultimately, they were both held in the mirror. It waited, reflected, and recorded. And the quiet observer kept marking her presence as the plantation once again fell into its suffocating rhythm. Every drawing, every scrape, and every recalled tale brought her one step closer to a reckoning that the Avery house's walls were not yet ready for. The Avery estate's margins had started to deteriorate due to the summer heat, which was also seeping into the walls and thickening the air like damp linen. Clarissa Avery was so alert that her eyes had become empty. With unfathomable accuracy, a new symbol appeared in the mirror every morning as she woke up. Shapes, lines, and spirals that were both familiar and alien, as though they had come from a memory older than herself. She didn't mention them out loud. No one was able or ready to comprehend. The servants looked away from her. Even the town's elderly preacher declined to enter the premises, and the colonel disregarded her worries. The family experienced their first disaster on the 12th night. As erratic as its master, the colonel's beloved steed was discovered dead in the barn. The earth where its hooves had scrambled in fear was marked by a scarlet streak. Clarissa pointed to the triangle she had sketched the previous evening, which was divided by a sharp line. The coincidence was too exact to be ruled out. Once tentative, her writings now shuddered with urgency as she detailed the increasing presence in the room. Nobody answered. The plantation remained silent. Amara, invisible but keenly conscious, kept on observing in silence. She never touched the mirror as her hands moved with unwavering grace, dusting, washing, and smoothing. Her focus was not on the home, but rather on the pattern emerging, the recurring rhythm in the indications and the subsequent occurrences. Instinctively, she had realized that the mirror was more than just glass. It served as a vessel, a receiver, a recorder of memory and injustice. Every symbol had significance, conveying a message in a language that only she and the glass could understand. The colonel became agitated, his rage like a sword tearing through the estate. He reprimanded without distinction, hitting staff for perceived slights and snapping at others who erred by speaking too freely. Even though the whip had touched Amara's skin on previous days, leaving her with enraged red welts that hurt with each motion. Nevertheless, she endured the agony without protest. Her pain was listed, recalled, and woven into the patterns she drew in her secret notebook using charcoal. She learned to tolerate, to disappear, to be present without being noticed. Clarissa deteriorated as the waves of terror and power swept around her. She felt as if the mirror was mocking her. As if the glass itself were speaking, she started to hear faint but persistent murmurs at night. Some of the words were in a language older than English, while others formed vague phrases that she could not understand. She recalls. She notices. She holds off. The symbols grew in number, creating clusters that appear to vibrate with an unseen energy beneath the glass's surface. As if rehearsing may prevent crazy, she started talking to herself in broken phrases, slept less, and ate less. The tension in the home increased with expectancy. Each sign appeared to represent a different catastrophe. The unexpected collapse of a servant without any obvious reason, the death of a calf in the fields, and a fever that raced through the younger children. The designs were clearly visible. Nevertheless, the colonel declined to link them. But Clarissa could feel the threads getting tighter around her throat. None of the few servants who had known her in Charleston would risk looking disloyal, so she tried to confide in them. Meanwhile, Amara had started to mark the wooden frames that encircled the mirror, tiny scratches that could only be read by her trained eye, spirals, arcs, curves, and a code put on top of the symbols that were previously visible in the glass. Or maybe it mirrored what was already in Amara's head, but the mirror answered. The night following the catastrophe on the 15th, Clarissa. She was motionless in front of the glass. She trembled for the first time as she stared at a new symbol, a spiral with a thin vertical line intersecting it, like a finger pointing downward. She was convinced that the mirror was alive and knew more than she could ever hope to comprehend. Amara's quiet persistence and patience started to show in a different way on the 16th night. After doing her chores, she lingered in the room and watched Clarissa as well as the mirror. Her eyes had a recognition, a comprehension of sadness, anxiety, and expectation. Additionally, she started putting subliminal clues on walls and floorboards, suggesting the messages from the mirror were not limited to glass. Something more significant was stirring, something that would not be subdued by neglect, brutality, or the stigma associated with the Avery name. The Avery home was a patchwork of anxiety and dread at the end of the month. The colonel was furious. The attendants muttered. Amara, silent yet unflappable, became the invisible axis around which the house's events started to revolve once Clarissa dispored. No one was able to stop the rhythm of blood, pain, and terror. In a composition that had just started to play, every tragedy was a note. It had become chilly in the house with every week went by, not because of winter, for it was still summer, but rather because of something heavier that hung over the ceilings and seeped into the floorboards. As if the act itself might anchor her to reality, Clarissa Avery traced the familiar shapes of the furniture as she wandered through her corridors, eyes wide and blind. The symbols in the mirror grew in number every morning, their lines tighter, their shapes more intricate, and now they were accompanied by subtle whispers that were initially barely detectable and brushed the borders of her awareness. As usual, Amara walked through the house quietly, methodically, and observingly. Maybe the mirror understood her language, or maybe she comprehended the mirrors. She spent more time each night close to the mirror, following faint arcs and scuffs down the frame, directing the glass to some place that only she understood. A servant falling in the middle of a task, a horse refusing to eat, a lantern toppling without wind. All of these minor mishaps and disasters caused the house to quiver. Clarissa started to notice links and patterns she was unable to fully identify. Her letters to her sister were desperate, half-written in ledger margins, sent unsigned, sealed and concealed, never to be seen by anybody. The rumors grew louder one evening following a day of intense heat. Long after the rest of the household had gone to sleep, Clarissa sat in front of the mirror. For fear of the shadows themselves reacting to her, she dared not move. Then, in a voice so faint she could have imagined it, she heard a phrase in English. She observes. Her heartbeat thumped in her ears as she froze. With her heart pounding against silence, she looked around the room for any living thing. But all she could find was the subdued figure of Amara. Sitting silently in the corner with her hand alongside the symbols, words started to appear in the glass as brief, jagged pieces. Keep in mind, observe, hold on. Clarissa's sleep turned into a torture of half-recollection, half-dream, in which the faces of women whose life had been taken by uniformed men appeared in the glass, pale and silent. She grabbed for faces that blinked and disappeared. Her health started to deteriorate. She shied away from food, spoke less, and shuddered at the slightest hint of a floorboard. The new symbols seemed to beat as if alive every morning, a beating she was unable to stop. Amara waited silently. Every mark she made on the frame and every small movement she made conveyed a message, a rhythm, or a strategy. She shifted as if the home were her own body, negotiating its perils with the forbearance of one who was well acquainted with the topography of pain. She recalled the cries that had filled her ears, the horror that had been forced upon her before she could even speak, and the death of her mother. Her perseverance, awareness, and the lessons she left behind were all powered by that memory. After weeks of being tormented in whispers, the mirror broke one night. It didn't break all the way, but a thin crack ran across the middle, a vein so dark that light could hardly flow through it. Clarissa flinched, her image warped, sharp, strange. Faint letters, newly formed and bold, appeared beside the fracture. "Are you aware of what he did?" Unable to take her eyes off it, she gasped. The statements were loaded with the weight of accusations and the seriousness of long-kept secrets. Clarissa's strength diminished, and she turned pallid in the days that followed. Even with the colonel in command, the mansion no longer felt secure. Rumors of curses, weird happenings, and voices borne by wind and wood were whispered by visitors from neighboring plantations about the disaster at Avery Estate. Anxiety grew throughout the household, but nobody knew where it came from, not even the colonel, who became enraged and frustrated by his wife's growing frenzy. But Amara's silent presence did not waver. She now moved with intention, leaving behind tiny, intentional clues throughout the house. such as scratches along the walls and markings in the floorboards, extensions of her will that were driven by memory and her understanding of invisible things. She had discovered that the glass would react to intent as well as fear. The mirror was more than just a reflection. It was now a vehicle for something greater, something more alert, more accurate, and more patient. Amara, the mirror, and the murmurs in the house all waited in the hush as the house held its breath. Glass. The house had not become any more tranquil despite the passage of months since the first symbol was displayed. On the mirror in Clarissa Avery's room, the sweltering summer heat had given way to a dampness that appeared to seep through the walls, and if anything, the tension in the air had intensified. With her hands shaking with every note she scribbled and concealed, Clarissa herself had become a shell of her former grace. The mirror, now fractured along a dark vein at its center, pulsed with a presence that defied denial with every new symbol she secretly recorded. Once weak, its whispers had become stronger, occasionally forming words in a language she could almost understand, occasionally just providing the silent reminder that something is alive and observing. Amara was still inside the house. She navigated the rooms with the calm forbearance of someone who had integrated into the very architecture of the manor. She swept, dusted, and cleaned, but she also paid attention, leaving arcs and scratches on the walls, floorboards, and wooden frames that only she could understand. Every mark matched the symbols in the mirror, creating a web of unspoken messages that ran through the house's very foundation. She seemed to have taken on the role of the mirror's agent, transforming its power into something concrete. While the colonel, growing more and more unwell and agitated, shouted at the accidents that now seemed to plague his family, the other slaves shunned her, sensing a gravity they did not comprehend. The health of the colonel declined. Unexpected fever episodes left him weak and confused. Despite her fear, Clarissa paid close attention to every new symbol in the mirror, noting every curve, line, and detail. She was unable to touch it, remove it, or disobey it. Nevertheless, she sensed a somber realization developing within of her. It was more than just a reflection in the mirror. It served as a witness, a ledger, and a conduit for justice and remembrance. Amara watched her, silent as ever, a steady presence that brought neither threat nor consolation, merely the subdued promise of something more to come. When Clarissa woke up one night, the mirror was completely exposed. With clusters merging, spirals interwoven with lines, arcs colliding with triangles, the symbols had multiplied, creating a language that no one could read, but whose intensity was undeniable. Then, for the first time, she noticed another figure in the glass. The silhouette of a lady with dark, unblinking eyes and an unmistakable presence. Clarissa's heart ceased beating. The stranger looked directly at her as though evaluating, judging, or recognizing her. Desperation and terror. Then she realized that the figure was not a ghost. It served as a witness, a testament, and a record of perseverance. Amara took a step forward, her hands hanging close to the edge of the mirror, drawing invisible lines that only she could see. She remained silent. She didn't blink. She exuded composure and authority, as if the house itself were under her control. Clarissa realized then what she had been too scared to acknowledge. Amara's understanding was expanded by the whispers, the symbols, and the mirror. The silence, which had once been terrible, now carried power because of her recollection and her perseverance. The Avery home had changed by morning. The colonel was lying helpless. The kids stopped talking, and Clarissa, weak but alert, kept watching the mirror. But among the far-off meadows, the estate, suddenly silent and quivering under an unseen burden, murmured rumors. The deserted mansion, the mirror that reflected more than faces, and the sightings of a woman with fire-like eyes behind the glass were all mentioned by travelers. Amara was never seen leaving the grounds, but her presence persisted despite the arcs, scrapes, and lines, a silent power that had mastered the art of distorting the very perception of the former rulers. The Avery estate eventually became a folktale, a warning recited across the plantation. Those who ventured to peer into the mirror reported seeing shadows that moved on their own, a figure whose eyes bore the burden of millennia of recollection, and reflections that were not their own. And there was one unquestionable fact in each whispered story. The house now belonged to the mute witness who had persevered, recalled, and asserted her right. not to the living or the dead. The last reflection, a testimonial, was in the broken and throbbing mirror, to endurance, forbearance, and an ineptitude that no mortal hand could remove. No mortal hand could remove.